Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Hayden Clark, your host, and I am excited to introduce our special guest to you in just one second. But before doing that, I want to say thank you to our patron supporters. Thanks so much for your support. You too can become a patron supporter by following the Patreon link in the description below and just going over there and checking that out. With that, you get access to the bonus segment. 5 more minutes with whoever my guest is that week, and so you get access to all of those. So be sure and do that if you like what you see and want to support the show. But now I want to bring in my special guest. His name is Dr. Josh Rasmussen. Dr. Josh, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm wonderful, thank you.
Yes, it's excellent to have you on. As we were talking beforehand, I'm familiar with your work, your books, as well as the stuff you do online. I've seen you a number of times on Capturing Christianity over there with Cameron Bertuzzi, and really like listening to you. And so I'm very excited to have you on.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be with you. We'll see how this conversation goes. It's always fun talking about philosophy. So,
Yes, it definitely is. And I always forget to do this, so I want to do this real quick. If you have questions, you can submit them in the live chat. Tag at Help Me Believe. That'll help me see it. Of course, if you do a super chat, I'll definitely see it that way, and we'll address the super chats first. But tag at Help Me Believe, and preferably make your questions for Dr. Josh. But if you want to ask me something, I guess you're more than welcome to. But before we get to the Q&A, let's get to the interview. Dr. Josh, I thought it would be helpful if you gave a brief introduction of yourself for those who may not be familiar with who you are.
yeah, so I teach philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. My passion is to understand things, anything, money, relationships. But my interest takes me into sort of fundamental principles. And so in my academic work, I'm trying to find out, like, what are the fundamental principles of existence and minds? Those are kind of my two main areas, existence and minds. But in conversations like with my wife, we'll also talk about, like, what are the fundamental principles of relationships, of purpose, of money, of time management. So I've noticed that about myself, that I just really love to seek a greater understanding, and there's really no end to that. So that's who I am, a philosopher.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction there. Sorry, I'm trying to do some things over here on the technical side of things. There we go. Okay. Uh, so that's interesting that so your wife is also interested in philosophy or apologetics, that sort of stuff.
She's got a similar interest to sort of understand things.
Yeah.
And I was telling her the other day, it sounds like you like to think on the edges
Yeah.
of things. She said, yeah. She's always kind of like exploring on the edges, kind of breaking the boundaries. And it's kind of interesting because in apologetic culture, it's kind of aimed a little bit more towards kind of helping somebody to see maybe an existing understanding, or maybe there's kind of an emphasis on a defense. And so there's sort of an interesting relationship, I think, between the philosophers and the apologists that could even have a kind of a point of tension, because the philosophers and the scientists too, we're interested in kind of exploring. Our gratification comes from breaking down existing paradigms and discovering new ones.
Yeah.
But I do think that people can work together by discovering things and then helping other people see what's been discovered.
Wow.
But yeah, so she's very much with me on this.
Wow.
In fact, we even recently wrote a book together on.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
and by the way,
yeah,
to the audience, you can in the description there'll be links. There are links to Dr. Rasmussen's website as well as his books on Amazon. So be sure and check those out. But yeah, that's very interesting. So tell me, how did you become a Christian in the first place, and then also kind of how did you get interested in philosophy?
so my family is my dad is actually a pastor of a church, and so Christianity was kind of in the background for me. Um, it's sort of one of those things where it's kind of part of the culture. And in my family, my dad and my community emphasized thinking and exploring. And so I never felt kind of barred from exploring. There wasn't sort of this situation where I had questions and then somebody said, "Oh, you just have to have faith." In fact, I remember the first time I read through the entire Bible, page after page, I was like, I think 15, and I had questions on different parts of the Bible, and I would put a circle on the top of the page and underline my question. And like basically like every 3 pages or so, like I had questions for my dad. And so I remember one day saying, "Okay, Dad, I've got some questions for you." And I started going through like question after question after question. And he was able to answer like about 80% of the questions just right off the top, like very satisfying answers. And then he gave me a commentary that helped answer another 10%. And that left another 10% of
Wow.
questions for me to think about and explore. So I just want to kind of emphasize that my upbringing was one where thinking was valued. Then later in high school, I began to sort of think beyond the edges of what I'd seen in my community, and this led me to um, just not know what to think about Christianity, even about the existence of God. So I became agnostic. And then after that, it was just from further exploration and study that brought me into a vision of reality that was greater, I mean, which isn't surprising. I mean, reality is, of course, greater than any limited person sees. And so I saw a greater vision of reality and an understanding of God's existence and the foundation of existence that just made a lot more sense to me. And that's kind of what got me more into the field of philosophy. But that's maybe a little bit more than what you were asking, but it kind of, I think, helps to kind of fill out a little bit of that background. It wasn't, in my case, it wasn't that I was sort of raised as a non-Christian and then
Right.
found my way into it. I was raised in that framework. And to be honest, because of that, there is a certain kind of maybe worry that some people might have, and maybe, well, I would have too, which is that is my current view of the world motivated by my upbringing rather than based on really seeing what's true
Mm.
about the world. And I think for that very reason, I personally feel like I have almost like I have a higher responsibility to really look at things from the outside. And that, by the way, that stage of agnosticism really helped me to see, okay, this is what it looks like from the outside. It seemed like after that, I was able to relate to people who would be skeptical of Christianity in a way that they would feel understood.
Right.
And so that was kind of important, I think, for me.
Yeah. I do find it not unique or not wholly unique that in the Christian household you said that just thinking and thinking critically was a virtue. I'm not gonna say that's unique, but that is something that a lot of people have complained about, I suppose, in the past. That being brought up in the Christian home is really um, dogmatic, and dogmatic in the sense that you're not taught to critically think. You're taught to just take it on faith, like you were saying, was not the case for you. Um,
Yeah.
it wasn't really the case for me either, though there were those influences when I would ask questions and maybe a Sunday school teacher or somebody would say, you just got to have faith. But yeah, my parents were, they would be honest if they didn't know something. And it's not like I was being taught, anti-science or something like that. It's just, but I don't know.
If I can ask, just kind of
Yeah,
play off this a little bit, like,
sure.
had you ever had an experience where there's some questions that might sort of feel dangerous to your community? Like
Oh,
maybe it's okay to ask the question, but like if you actually start to believe some of those things, like that would be kind of dangerous, sort of a feeling of danger. You shouldn't go there.
I want to say yes. I'm trying to think of particular, not in my home.
Yeah,
My parents were very much think for yourself. We want you to be your own individual. We set up
yeah,
boundaries to keep you safe, not safe intellectually, but physically safe. But
yeah.
as far as that goes, explore whatever you want and be your own person. But I was raised in a very conservative Southern Baptist church, which I love, and I love all the people there. I'm not dogging on them. I'm just saying there was a whole we may not talk about this or
Mm-hmm.
or as far as we're going to talk about it, we're going to shut it down really quick.
Yeah,
We're going to bring it up and then just tear it down real quick. And the tear down would be that's liberalism, and so we're not going there or something like that.
yeah.
Um, or
That's what I mean. Yeah, there's
yeah,
kind of like a fence and then there's a
uh huh.
danger there. Like don't go over there.
You can ask the question,
Yeah,
but we're going to shoot it down real quick. And if you have follow up questions, be quiet. Or not be necessarily be quiet because I'm
yeah.
talking about nice people, very nice people.
Well,
But
and I understand that that doesn't characterize everybody in that culture. What I've noticed is that every single culture has a mix of, some people are kind of maintaining the territory,
mm-hmm,
and there's some value in that, and then some people are kind of exploring the edges, and there's value in that, and so there are these. I've just noticed this shows up in like every context. If you're
mm-hmm,
talking about debates between the left and the right, or
Yeah,
between
yeah.
atheism and theism,
And then you get the
you
wild
always find
card.
this sort of pattern.
And then you get the wild
Yeah,
card who just runs as fast as he can through everything, like me. And that's
through
basically
everything.
what happened. As in seminary at a Southern Baptist seminary, which again I love, did my degree there. I'm very thankful for it. I realized that there were, dang, I just had a good way of putting it. Now I don't. But basically, there were certain assumptions being
Hmm.
made that were not being explored, not being encouraged to explore, because that's liberalism, or that's,
Hmm.
whatever. And so that's what led me first to doubt, and then from doubt led me to apologetics, like everybody else that's in this area, or specifically led me to philosophy. Um, and so yeah, that's kind of how it went for me. Was I was I was gonna say, I was realizing that I'm only learning about certain positions from people who don't hold them, specifically atheism. So I'm
Hmm.
learning about atheism from non-atheists, and it just kind of clicked on
Hmm.
me. That's probably not the best way to learn about atheism. If you want to learn about it, you should read atheists, and
Yeah,
that's what was not encouraged, to
yeah,
not do that. And if, as soon as you tell me, contrarian, just my personality, don't do that, like Adam and Eve,
yeah,
I'm gonna be like, I'm gonna do that, probably just because
yeah,
you told me not to do it. So
yeah,
that's not a virtue. I'm just saying that's me. And so that's what I
yeah,
did. That's what I did. I started reading atheist literature, and then I was like, oh crap, uh, what if they're right? They have some points here. And
yeah,
so that was my break from uh, that kind of thinking into a more humble, critical thinking. I
yeah,
think and of course it's kind of contradictory to say I think uh, that it's humility, like I'm bragging about humility, but I think philosophy for me created
hmm
a much more humble position. But
yeah, yeah. Once you've kind of moved across enough fences and you start to see how different people can be reasonable from their
right,
viewpoint, and they don't really even fit the stereotypes that are cast upon them from people from other places, from other fences. And then what I found is that once you've kind of moved through enough playgrounds, when you're in a playground, people will even sort of cast that stereotype upon you, even if you can come back into
right,
the other playground.
uh
And,
huh,
and so it's
yeah,
because there's not as
I
many
see,
people who are running around across
right, yeah,
the different playgrounds.
yeah,
And so
that,
that's something I've noticed.
uh huh.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that was kind of I followed your analogy, but for the audience, I think what you meant was, uh, if you do kind of what I've done, even if, or what you've done, once you come, even if you end up where you started, say Christianity, um, you might now get those things leveled against you, which are leveled against atheists by other Christians. Is that what you're
Yes.
saying?
Yeah, and by atheists as well, because there's the stereotype
Mhm.
there that you're not a critical thinker.
Right.
So, you couldn't be somebody who's actually exploring and really seeking to understand. You're sort of fenced in by your
Hmm.
ideology. And often, like, coming back doesn't mean coming fully back. It means you've
Right.
come back to something bigger
Right.
that has some intersection with the core.
Hmm.
Um, and with even more than that, there's filling out of details as well.
Yeah.
I wanted just to insert in here, you were saying that liberalism was sort of the kind of the bad
The
thing
boundary
in the
marker.
world. Yeah,
Yeah.
in the world that I'm in the academic world, conservatism is the
Uh huh.
boundary point.
Yeah.
If you have flagged anything that might suggest that you're in that camp,
It's
then that's a red flag.
it's what I've heard Leighton Flowers call the boogeyman fallacy, and I'm not saying he coined that term. I just remember hearing him say it, the boogeyman fallacy.
It's
It
how we think.
Yeah.
We are social creatures. We can't hardly help it.
Yeah, I think there's probably something, I don't know what it is, psychologically, whatever it might be, that there has to be some kind of boundary marker for whatever reason. There has to be.
Yeah, we need our boogeyman. Yeah, we need
Yeah.
the enemy. It sort of orients, it gets our focus, gets our energy going.
Hmm.
Otherwise, it's hard to really think about these abstract things.
Yeah.
These things are so foundational. I've often wondered, like, maybe even God sort of plays a role in the design of the whole universe to sort of fine tune the different cultures so that there's the right kind of motivation and interest based around sort of heroism and courage to get to truths that really matter.
Yeah.
But then you sort of need, it gets complex,
It
because
does. Yeah. But it is
not every
interesting.
side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's definitely something there. Well, we could have a whole episode on that.
All right.
But I do appreciate you bringing it up because it is interesting. But let's bring up the contingency
Yep.
argument. This is something that you've discussed quite a bit online, at least, and in your written literature as well.
Yeah.
So let's start with kind of what is not the formulation, but just kind of what's the general idea of a contingency argument, and what's kind of like a brief history of it. Where does it come from?
Yeah, so it's an argument for an explanation of contingent things. These are things like iPhones or my own existence that can fail to be. Their existence, their inclusion within reality isn't a matter of necessity, and the contingent argument seeks to explain the contingent things in terms ultimately of a supreme thing. As far as history, I mean, really from the beginning of recorded history, you have this. Plato had a form of a argument from cause and effect or cosmological argument, and then Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. A lot of people think of Thomas Aquinas when they think of this argument, but a lot of his stuff comes from Aristotle
Mhm.
in his argument from motion, and really kind of drawing out, what is motion? Motion is a type of change. What is change? It's an actualization of a potential. What is a potential? Potential is something that is contingently actual. And so you have sort of these great historical thinkers developing the argument. And one way I've kind of thought about it is like there's this core idea that philosophers have been working on and developing in details from kind of the beginning of recorded history. And people have been thinking about this. And then in the last century, and really the last 50 years, that's the freshest in my own mind, there's been developments of the argument that make it more precise and show how to articulate it in contemporary logic. The turn of the century, since year 2000, even a little bit slightly before, there's some hints of this in the 1970s, a few hint articles that hint at this. There was a kind of modal version of the argument from contingency, an argument from possibility, modal having to do with possibility. So all that to say, and actually, just a little caveat,
Sure.
even Duns Scotus, so this is before the last 50 years, he also kind of had a modal version. So I really shouldn't say it was completely invented just in the last
Right.
20 years or so, but it's been articulated in the contemporary logic of possibility. And that's an interesting development. But all of this is just developing a core idea that's been seen throughout history, if
Right.
that makes sense.
Yeah. So, because you brought it up, what do you think of um, the way Thomas Aquinas puts things? So he seems to be making a contingency argument uh, in his distinction between existence and essence argument.
Yeah.
Um, that's kind of what I gathered from the first time I read about the Aquinas' distinction between existence and essence, which seems to be an explanation of what a contingent thing is. A contingent thing is something whose existence and essence are distinct, and then a necessary being like God is going to be a being whose existence and essence are one and the same, or more precisely, probably a being whose essence just is existence. What do
Yes,
you think about
that
the way he
that's
puts it?
that's loading in more than is necessary for the argument. So yeah, he has this distinction between existence and essence, or esse, esse, and essentia, the act of existing and the sort of the nature of the thing. I remember reading a long time ago there's sort of the distinction between that it is versus what it is.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of this argument that God that collapses. So that God is and what God is numerically the same.
Mm-hmm.
There is no real distinction there. Um, well, contemporary philosophers, they aren't thinking of contingency that way. They're thinking of contingency as just anything. Contingent thing is anything that can fail to be, doesn't have to exist. And you might argue that anything that's distinct from its existence is also,
Right.
I want to say, ipso facto contingent, in virtue of that fact, contingent. Um, but that's going to require further argument, and that's more than is necessary for the argument from contingency. And even I myself am not sure of that. That's something I've been thinking about more recently. I'm sort of a long-time skeptic, actually, of that idea, but it's been growing on me. So I just want to emphasize, you don't need that. You don't need to make that distinction. You could, for example, just to make this a little more concrete, you could think that God, his existence is distinct from his nature, but God is a necessarily existing foundation for all contingent things. And he's supreme. He's got a supreme nature. and his supreme nature is distinct from his active existence. You could think that, I mean, that's a conceptual possibility. So that's not required for the argument.
Right. So you tend to think of, as that was going to be one of the questions, is how do we define
Yeah.
our terms here? But so
Yeah.
you define a contingent thing as something which could fail to exist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then a necessary thing is going to be something which could not fail to exist.
That's right. Yeah. And that's the contemporary usage of the term.
Okay.
And like I said, it might be that after further argumentation, I mean,
Yeah.
there are interesting arguments, that one could draw this out, but just not required for the argument.
Right. So, with respect to Aquinas, then I think what you're saying is it could be the case that it could be the case that contingent things can fail to exist because their existence and essence are separate, but it's not necessary to make that point because contemporary philosophers are fine with just saying it can fail to exist.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's no reason
that's
to
right.
do more work.
That's well put. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, I like that because it means that Aquinas could be right. I like it when Aquinas is right. I'm not gonna lie, but it doesn't.
Yeah, he could be right. Yeah, the way I think about it, there's many roads to truth.
Right.
It's the abundance of riches, and so I think sometimes people make the mistake of trying to show that all other riches are actually fool's gold, so you can look at my riches. I don't want to do that here. I just want to separate the riches and say, yeah, you can have those too, perhaps, but they're not necessary to get this argument going.
Is it universal in contemporary philosophy that these are accurate descriptions of reality, contingency and necessary?
That my definitions are the definitions that are universally used, or what do you mean?
I mean, does anybody object to this idea, just defining things this way? Or you were saying this is how contemporary philosophers use it today. I was wondering, does anybody else do anything differently?
I've not seen that.
No, it's just a question. I don't know anything. Yeah, I'm just curious.
I've not seen that. Personally, I've not seen that. If some, I've written a few books on this. I've talked to a lot of philosophers, but that doesn't mean I've seen everything. So, if somebody sees something that I haven't seen, send me an email. Let me know. I haven't seen that.
No, it wasn't coming from I know something. It was coming from.
No, and my response is just like I want to be as honest in my response as I can be. So.
Oh yeah, you're good.
Because it actually does bother me when people kind of come across with more authority than they actually see one of my core values. Yeah. And this is maybe more important than the arguments are important, but some of these sort of underlying values, I think, are more powerful than the arguments themselves.
Right.
Because this is how you really get to truth. This is how you really build the arguments in good ways that are helpful. One of my core values is to not say more than I see, and to not say less than I see either.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where that comes from.
That's good. Okay, so how would you formulate the argument, say, in premises leading to a conclusion?
Yeah, so it's funny. I actually don't have a canonical formulation. It seems like I always give a different formulation every time. This maybe shows the sort of explorer in me.
Yeah.
But one formulation I like would be, actually, here's a new one. I was just thinking about this one yesterday. I thought this might be kind of an intuitive way of formulating it. So let's just try this. The universe is contingent. Whatever is contingent, the cause. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
Right.
That would be sort of a stage one, and then stage two would be whatever would cause the universe would be God. Therefore, God is the cause of the universe.
Yeah. So
that's a nice kind of simple way of putting it. Then we can look at each premises.
Right. Yeah. So let's start with number one, which was the universe. Was that the universe is contingent?
Yeah.
Okay.
So here I was thinking we could just define the universe as well, actually, let me be careful here. Yeah, let's do this. So let's say the universe is the totality of contingent things, or even a plurality of contingent things. So we don't have to assume that the universe is a thing in its own right, but it is just all the contingent things together. Mm-hmm. And now this gets into definition, and we can take different paths depending on how we want to define things, but maybe for simplicity, we'll go like this. We'll say that we'll just stipulate that that the universe is like a set in the following sense. A set is defined by its members. So if you have a set 1, 2, 3, and then you have a set 1, 2, those aren't the same sets because they have different members. So if the universe is the set of the contingent things, then if the universe changes with respect to one contingent thing, then you've got a different set. So technically, you've got a different universe. Okay. On this definition, the universe is contingent if any of its members are contingent, because it's defined by its members. And so if anything is contingent, if anything can fail to be, like I have a certain thought in my mind and then it ceases to be, that thought's now gone. So that thought was contingent. So it looks like there's at least one contingent thing, the thought that I just had. And so if the universe then is defined by its members, it doesn't have to have its members as contingent members. Therefore, the universe is contingent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that would be one way of going. Another way, if you don't like that way of defining things, you might think that the universe can still exist even if it changes its members. And so then to argue for the contingency of the universe would involve a kind of subtraction argument, that as you subtract contingent things, that never forces some other contingent thing to come into being. The removal of something doesn't force something else to come into being. So you could sort of subtract out all the contingent things. This would be, at least in principle, possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then this would leave you with the possibility of no universe, which is enough to show the universe is contingent. Because again, just to be very clear for the audience, to be contingent means that it's possible to be non-existent, can fail to be. So if the universe can fail to be, then the universe is contingent.
Okay. How
That makes
does it does. How does the argument for the contingency of the universe not commit the fallacy of
fallacy of composition.
yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's good. Okay. So, it's very interesting because sometimes I was thinking this morning during my jog actually that people will use terms like fallacy, that argument is a fallacy, or commits a fallacy, in ways I think are actually really unhelpful. And professional philosophers tend not to do this. I actually find this more in the popular sphere. It's unhelpful because usually what's going on is not that there is a kind of simple mistake, but there is a pattern of reasoning that doesn't follow another pattern of reasoning. So let me draw this out a little bit. So um, the fallacy of composition is the fallacy of inferring that the whole has the properties of its parts just because it's a whole. So for example, you say that the whole of all of the particles that make up a table, those particles are themselves tables because the whole is a table. Well, that's a fallacy. You can't infer that, if the particles are non-tables and the whole is a non-table. That doesn't work. Okay. So you might think that that's the sort of pattern of thinking here. If you think that, well, each part of the universe is contingent, therefore the whole is contingent, because I'm using this inference. The underlying assumption is that I'm assuming that necessarily wholes inherit the properties of the parts. Okay. My response to this is that wasn't the inference, that wasn't the assumption that I was using to make my argument. So I didn't assume that the whole has all the properties of the parts, the whole inherits the properties of the parts, therefore the universe is contingent if any of the parts are contingent. That wasn't my argument. Instead, my argument, well, I gave two arguments depending on definitions. But the second argument there I gave was a subtraction argument. It was another principle that removing contingent things doesn't force something else. Removing things doesn't force other things to come into being. And if you think there's a kind of underlying energy that can't be created or destroyed, then you might think that underlying energy is necessarily existent. It's not actually contingent. We'll have to look at that later when we look at the nature of a necessary foundation. But if it's actually contingent, then by its own definition, there's no problem with removing it from reality, okay, by definition. And the principle was the subtraction argument that you could subtract out, at least in possibility, all these things that can be removed, and that would lead to the totality being removed. I sort of think of it like, in this case, the contingency of the whole does inherit the contingency of the parts in the sort of the way that the brownness of a floor inherits the brownness of its parts. Right. So there are cases where the whole inherits the properties of the parts, and so you have to look at those cases and see why it works in those cases. So I'm not assuming the sort of general inference from parts to wholes.
Right.
And so I think it's good for me to kind of go into detail on that, a little bit of detail, because this comes up a lot in sort of academic contexts. Yeah, it becomes kind of a stumbling block.
It's also not always a fallacy. For example, it is a fallacy if you want to say every wall or every brick in the wall weighs 2 pounds, therefore the wall weighs 2 pounds. That would be a fallacy. But if every brick in the wall is red, then the wall's going to be red. So it's not
That's right.
always a fallacy.
Yeah, the whole sometimes does inherit
Yeah,
the
the
features of the
properties.
parts,
Yeah.
and sometimes you can actually see that it does.
Mhm.
In the case of the redness, you can actually see that, and I think in the case of contingency, there's a good argument for it as well.
Yeah.
So nice point. Yeah.
Um, the next point was things that are contingent have causes. Is that what it was?
The next premise was, yeah, the contingent things have a cause. So the universe is contingent. Whatever's contingent has a cause. And here, just very quickly, just pointing to two reasons. One reason would be from universal experience.
Right.
You don't experience uncaused contingent things. And the way I like to put it is like the best explanation of our observations is the simplest one. And the simplest one that I can think of here is just that contingent things have causes.
Right.
That explains our observation.
Yeah. It's just an
Uh,
observation. Yeah.
yeah, sometimes I like to tell this story. We used to have cockroaches in our house. They just came out of the bathrooms and they were big. And my kids, one of my small kids, who was too small to be afraid of bugs, was like picking up one of the bugs and just playing with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just so nasty. And so one of the things that we did was we barricaded the entrances, and that solved the problem because the cockroaches couldn't come into existence. But I remember like at nighttime going under the sheets, just in case I don't want bugs getting into me while I'm sleeping. So like barricading the sheets, I'm protected. But of course, I could never protect myself from the
Yeah.
place of non-being,
Right.
right? Because maybe the roaches from the land of imagination, the land of non-being, they could just pop into being
Yeah.
from nothing.
Yeah.
I wasn't worried about that. From universal experience, not just roaches, anything.
Anything.
There's no
Elephant might
exception
pop
there.
in there. Um,
Yeah,
so Elizabeth Anscombe, I think, philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe has a really good response. She's specifically responding to Hume, but how would you know, which is, you could put it in the form of a question, which is, how would you know that something popped into existence and did not teleport from somewhere really quickly that you don't know where it came from? Because that is what we would actually assume anyway. If something
yeah,
did pop into existence right here in front of me, I wouldn't, actually my first thought would be, wouldn't be that I'm hallucinating. I don't do drugs and there's not a gas leak, but it would be that somebody was playing a trick on me somehow. But and then I would assume that it teleported somehow through some
yeah,
quantum physics that I don't understand, and
yeah. I don't actually
that's
see
how
that
it
as
got
an
her.
objection. I think that's just another way of confirming that, not only don't we see this, but maybe we even couldn't
Right.
see an exception to this. That's not a problem. I mean, this reminds me of the this sort of so-called falsification principle. It's like it can't be true. You can't believe that it's actually true unless you can falsify it. Well, okay, but I mean, you can't falsify that 2 + 2 = 4. That's not a reason to think that 2 + 2 is not equal to 4, or even that you don't have good reason to think it does equal 4. So my answer is to say this argument from universal experience supports the principle, and merely it having no ability to disconfirm the principle
Mm-hmm.
doesn't disconfirm the principle
Yeah.
and doesn't undercut our evidence for the principle
Oh
either.
yeah. So I was not trying to bring up a hypothetical objection of the falsification principle. I was just pointing
No, I
out that.
know,
Oh,
but
okay.
I
Yeah.
think that her famous objection, as it's articulated here, um, doesn't undermine the
Mm-hmm.
sort of
Right.
argument from experience.
Right. Yeah.
That's all I'm
Oh,
saying. And
okay. I
yeah,
got you.
her objection is the famous one, but it doesn't undermine this
Mm-hmm.
argument.
So, let's see. So that was premise 2, premise 3. So I don't think that, I just want to skip straight to this. I don't think a lot of people are going to object to the idea that there must be something which is necessary. I think, would you agree with that?
Oh, well, this is interesting. I think there's been some shift maybe recently. In kind of my earlier days talking about this, that was where all the action was. And I mean, I remember talking in graduate school with a graduate student. He said that he thought that, um, let me separate the cases in my mind, different conversations. If there were a necessary thing, it wouldn't be a material thing. And the action has been sort of focused on that. I mean, William Rowe in his book, 1975, updated 1997, on the cosmological argument, he focuses on the argument for a necessary thing, and he kind of closes the book by teasing out these divine properties. So it's like material things wouldn't be necessary, couldn't be an ultimate cause. So kind of in the history of the argument, that as far as I've read, it seems like no, all the action has been toward being skeptical of a necessary cause of the universe. But more recently, things seem to be shifting. I mean, you have people like Graham Oppie,
That's what I was going to bring
uh,
up.
a
Yeah.
famous naturalist philosopher. atheist philosopher, and he's moved along towards thinking that there's a necessary thing for various reasons. And so it's almost like because, it's sort of that we're social creatures thing, because some of the sort of leading thinkers who aren't theists are taking on board a necessary thing. It's almost like now the kind of the dialectical game has shifted a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Graham must be the leading atheistic philosopher. I mean, but to my mind, he is. I don't know, but as far as in popularity, and he's also very obviously good. I mean, in both senses. But I think, and you know it much better than I do. I think he's comfortable with, say, physical simples or something
Mhm.
along those lines. Is that right?
Or a physical starting point.
Right. So
Yeah,
there may be a necessary ground of existence, but it's going to be physical.
yeah,
How do you respond to that?
yeah.
Because
Let me just
yeah, go
to
ahead.
just to kind of complete the supports for the causal premise, and
Sure.
I'm not going to go into detail,
No,
but
you're fine.
there's also just this argument from intuition or reason, where wholly apart from experience, some things just sort of seem intuitive, and if you just think about a object just existing, your mind might sort of call for an explanation. And you might think sort of one kind of explanation is that it's got a cause, and another kind of explanation is that, well, it can't not be there.
Mhm.
So it exists because it's necessary. But if it's not necessary, then it's contingent. So to explain it, it's got to have a cause.
Yeah.
So I wanted just to point that in there, that there's also that kind of support. Um, yeah. And then as far as Graham Oppie, well, so this question about the nature of the foundational item leads us to stage two. So this is the final premise then in the argument I gave. If the cause of the universe, if there's a cause of the universe, then that cause is God.
Right.
And there are many different arguments. My sort of signature argument at this point would be sort of this argument from arbitrary limits. And it's interesting because I'll go into it, but it's interesting because Graham Oppie, last conversation I had with him at the end of the conversation, he said that he wanted to think more about that, the issue of arbitrary limits and boundaries at the foundation of things. So the argument, just very briefly, is that the foundational thing, okay, because it's foundational, is not going to have sort of further causes or explanations that explain its existence or its basic features. So if it has some basic features, let's say that are contingent, but let's say contingent features have a further explanation, then you have a contradiction. Because let me make sure this is clear.
Yeah, that's right.
If it's basic features, so I think it'll help to use concreteness.
Sure.
One of the um, one of the things I've come to realize is that people are able to understand things better when they're concrete. So imagine you have a turtle at the foundation of existence. Let's say this turtle, for whatever reason, has 5 legs. Okay,
Mhm.
it's got 5 legs, and you wonder, like, why does fundamental reality have a turtle? Well, there can't be an explanation because this is fundamental reality. You say, well, why does it have 5 legs? Why not 4 legs? Why not 3 legs? Well, let's say that those features, its legs, are fundamental features of fundamental reality. Okay, then by definition, it can't have a further explanation because it's fundamental.
Mhm.
But if having 3 legs or having 4 legs is a contingent state, then by the causal premise, contingent states have a further cause. That by the causal premise, there is a further cause of its legs. So the contradiction is that those legs are fundamental. There is no further cause, but they're contingent, so there is a further cause.
Mm.
Now, why I think they're contingent? Well, this is where my
Right.
signature argument comes in. It's that the difference between numbers of legs and the difference between a turtle that exists in our day and a turtle that exists at the foundation of reality, differences in numbers of legs and locations in time, are arbitrary differences in degrees of limitation, degrees of location. And these arbitrary limits don't make a difference with respect to being contingent or being caused.
So the
Uh,
analogy here is going to be physical things in our day and time are contingent. So
yeah,
to suggest that a physical thing at, say, the beginning of time is necessary is an arbitrary distinction. that perhaps
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, merely
because
changing the time.
right, because
Yeah,
everything in the present that is physical is contingent, it would seem to be a necessary feature or an essential feature of physical things that they be contingent.
yeah, I think that's right. And I think some people might
I
think,
never
well, the
thought of it
first
like
moment
that,
of
but
time.
wow.
Yeah, well, the difference in location of time. I mean, it's not like things on Wednesdays become necessary. Things on Tuesdays are contingent. It doesn't changing the time doesn't make a difference. Now, somebody who's listening to this, they might be thinking, well, wait, the first moment of time is special because we know there can't be something that caused the first moment of time. That's what makes it special. Okay, that's right. It is special. But the question is, what kind of a thing could exist without a cause?
Right.
So if there is a first moment or if there's a foundational element, what kind of a thing could that be? And the thought here is that merely changing the location of time is not enough to explain its ability to be uncaused. In fact, the very firstness of its location is just calling out for its needing to have some relevant difference to account for how it could be first.
Hmm. Maybe it actually doesn't have to do with being time and location or even size,
Yeah.
but divisibility. Isn't that the idea of a physical symbol, is that it cannot be reduced further?
So that I think could actually help. Being simple could help. So this is kind of the neat thing. It's like the more features that it has that resemble a supreme nature,
Right.
the more we're removing the need for an explanation.
Right.
So you might think, one reason for having an explanation is that it's complex. So it needs to be explained in terms of something else. So once we get to something simple, then you remove the need for it to be explained in virtue of its complexity. But let's say it's simple and shaped like a turtle.
Right.
Well, now we need a need for explaining that shape. Why does that turtle shape of all the shapes get to be instantiated without any cause or explanation?
Right. So
And
you're
so
getting into the metaphysics of it now.
yeah, I think we have to shave off all the features that would call for explanation. So maybe simplicity doesn't call for explanation, but having that particular limited shape has calls for
Right.
explanation. The difference between square and triangle is not a relevant difference with respect to having an explanation. And so
So
then you say, well, maybe it has no shape and it's a simple,
it's not
but it's
physical
still
anymore.
physical.
Yeah, it
But
can't
it's
be
still
physical.
physical, let's say. I mean, I actually talked with a philosopher, and this was kind of toward the end of graduate school. He's a logic professor, and so he was saying maybe the initial state is unbounded. It doesn't have limitations in that sense. Maybe it is simple, and so you start making it more and more like God, right?
Yeah.
Um, and okay, well, does it have any powers? Well, I think it would have powers. By power, I just mean causal power, the ability to produce an effect.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, he said, yeah, it does have powers because it's the original cause of all power.
Mm-hmm.
It's the source of power.
Which means it
How
has
much power does
potential.
it have?
You know?
How much power? Well, it does have a limited degree of power. Then we're back to the problem of having these arbitrary limits that call for further explanation. So if we shave off all the limits that call for further explanation, this unexplained ultimate thing, this sort of foundational thing, would then have unlimited power. So now it's simple, it's unlimited in power, it's
Boundless.
unbounded,
Yeah.
and I would say that it doesn't have um, any logical limits. So by a witness of my own knowledge, my own power to have knowledge, I realized that there's not a logical limit on power to um, now. I'm putting this in sort of a clumsy way. You
Mm-hmm.
might have to help me with this. What I'm trying to say is that the power to know, cognitive power,
Mm-hmm.
is built into the concept of the greatest conceivable power. And anything less than the greatest conceivable power builds in a logical limit on power. So if you're removing logical limits, if you're removing the kind of limits that call for further explanation, I think any logical limits would call for further explanation. You want to explain things as far as you can. Then the ultimate reality is going to have maximal conceivable power, which includes cognitive power,
Yeah.
which is a reason I would have for thinking that now it's a mind. It's a maximal mind. It's not a mind with arbitrary limits. It's a supreme mind.
Mm-hmm. So this was going to be the next question, and since you've already got into a few features of
Yeah.
the nature of this necessary being, what features I don't know if you want to use the word properties or not, whatever word you want to use. Can you deduce about this necessary being?
Yeah. So actually, in my recent thinking, I've actually been thinking it is maybe less helpful to try to deduce from necessity itself all the properties rather than kind of use a sort of argument from shaving off the arbitrary limits and then see what there is. And then what there is, I argue, is a supreme nature. And then from there, see what you can deduce from the supreme nature. That's kind of a development in my own thinking. It used to be that I would kind of first argue for a necessary thing, and I even have a publication called From a Necessary Being to God. So there is that kind of a pathway. But I mean, even that pathway requires a certain kind of causal principle that goes beyond the mere contingency principle, that contingent things have cause. Because you've got to show that somehow this foundational thing isn't merely necessary, but it also has a supreme nature. So, I think it's helpful to kind of think of uncovering sort of the nature of a necessary thing by shaving off its arbitrary limits, then seeing that's got to have a supreme nature, and then from there deducing the supreme properties like supreme power, supreme value, supreme knowledge, supreme cognitive power, which I think implies supreme knowledge, and so, or supreme mind is maybe a more careful way of putting it. Kind of leaves open how much knowledge the supreme mind would have. There are some questions there we could leave open at this stage. I don't want to rush ahead. And so then you could think of this as a hypothesis about fundamental reality that you not only sort of uncover through a pathway of reason, but that also has a high degree of predictive success. It like matches our experience in various ways. It predicts, for example, that there are these that there is a kind of moral reality, because it if you have a supreme mind, then a supreme mind would have a moral dimension to it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you can even have a mind without having value. Minds have value. And then you shave off the arbitrary limits to its value, it's got supreme value. And so this implies a kind of moral order or moral character to reality. It implies that there are principles of reason, that there are laws of logic even embedded in the nature of the foundation of reality. And this is something that many philosophers independently come to, that there are these sort of abstract forms of logic. It also predicts that there are these, I would say, person-building resources or powers to build persons. And we see, lo and behold, there are persons, which implies that there were person-building resources. And that's not trivial. I mean, if you just sort of imagine arbitrary random realities that you can conceive of, one reality is just a blank reality with nothing. Another one is just a simple single stone that can't produce persons. There's all sorts of alternative realities that don't have this kind of predictive success. And so theism, this kind of supreme foundation hypothesis, is, to my mind, the simplest hypothesis with the greatest predictive success. And so that's pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna go look at the questions we got from the live audience here in just a second. If you have any questions, by the way, just tag @HelpMeBelieve in the live chat, and I'll address those shortly. Sorry. But one last question for you, Dr. Josh, is what role, well, I guess it might be helpful to say, what is the principle of sufficient reason, and what role does it play in the argument from contingency? And kind of how does it come up? I think it usually comes up when somebody wants to arbitrarily stop explanations, like we were talking earlier, but I'll let you discuss that. I'm going to go find us some questions in the live chat.
Yeah, great question. There are different forms of it. Sort of on the strongest form would be like everything has an explanation. And then there are weaker forms like everything that's contingent has an explanation, or everything that's contingent that exists has an explanation. And even that term explanation, are we looking for a sufficient explanation or just some explanation, just a partial explanation? And so some forms of the principle of sufficient reason, the stronger forms, I don't think are required for this argument. But a kind of modest form that kind of comes in is to just explain things as far as you can, and where at least have some explanation, or at least have some sort of possibility of coming up with a theory that could provide an explanation. And there's a lot here because different principles lead into different arguments. So there are actually different pathways. And my favorite arguments go through very modest forms of the principle, so that skeptics of the sort of stronger principles of sufficient reason wouldn't have to be worried about the kind of pathways I offer. The pathways I offer are kind of more just embedded in how we think scientifically, seeking an explanation of our observations. And that kind of principle of explanation seeking in science is really all we need for the kind of argument that I. So.
Very good.
Yeah.
Got some questions out of the live audience. A liberal has appeared. Hello, Jonathan DePio. Thank you for that comment. That's a friend of mine, just being sarcastic. Let's see. Ethan Silva writes, how could this work, this being the contingency argument, if there are infinite universes or if the universe is eternal? And is Josh a classical theist?
Okay. So classical theism was also variously defined. If there's a kind of, I would say, well,
do you think
I would say
God
that
is a
I'm at
person?
home with the general idea of classical theism.
Okay.
So there's the personalist debate. Is God a person? Is God personal?
I'm guessing that's what
Some
the
of these,
question is behind the question, if I had to
yeah,
guess.
I think some of these things are hard for me to answer because I think the way that these things get defined, um, I'm sorry not to be more helpful, but I actually want to be just as very honest as I can be,
Sure.
which means that I can't give you a clear answer to that because of the way terms get defined.
Right.
But I'm
And
at home with the.
that's definitely a respectful and responsible answer, because there's so much on that is.
It's a
Yeah.
great question, and I really love this question about the eternality and the infinity
Yeah.
of the universe,
Yeah, go ahead.
because the great thing about the contingency argument is that it doesn't depend on the universe having a first moment in time. I know we talked about that as a kind of model, but that's not actually required for the contingency argument to work. If you sort of imagine, let's say, a big block of blue cheese, okay, and then you just imagine that block of blue cheese being a contingent type of thing, and now you just, in your imagination, change its size, you increase its size all the way out so that it's infinite. Well, the infinity of its size kind of remove its contingency. It doesn't. The change in size doesn't. It's not sufficient to explain a change in its nature. It's kind of like the blue tiles or the red bricks you mentioned. If you have an infinite stack of red bricks, the infinite stack of red bricks is still in its sort of totality a red stack. And the brown tiles, if it's all the way extended out, is still red. And I want to say that this is true both across space and across time. If this blue cheese were infinitely old, that wouldn't thereby remove its need for an explanation. Richard Taylor has this famous line that you don't explain the existence of a thing merely by extending its age. The age doesn't explain its existence.
Right.
And this is why William Rowe, he's got this example of an eternal star that is eternally giving off light. And in this case, it's the light that he's focused on. He's saying that light, there's always been light from all of eternity, and yet there's also always been an explanation of there being light from all of eternity in terms of the star.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah.
From Jonathan DePew, my friend here, asks, as Christians, how can we be sure that what we've discovered about the nature of God through arguments like this, coherent arguments, how can we be sure that what we discover about the nature of God through your arguments coheres with the nature of God revealed concretely in Jesus Christ?
So we can't be sure. Okay, I'm kind of playing a little bit here. That term "we" is a difficult word for me. I've been thinking a lot about this because I think that individuals have eyes, and I understand what it means when people say "we," but I think it's actually really helpful to think of this individually. So I can speak from my own kind of individual perspective, and I can't give you general principles that will apply to every individual. I can't answer it for the we. Can't do it because different eyes are just different things. But for me, when I'm thinking about sort of the connection between, let's say, special revelation and general revelation, sort of revelation through means of people having encounters with God and writing those down. And an example of this would, of course, be Christ and the revelation about Jesus of Nazareth and who he is, versus a kind of general revelation through reason and reflection nature, and evidence that is more universally accessible. What I do is I just think about the data that I have as an individual mind, and I have this picture of like a scale in my mind with evidence that can weigh on one side versus another side. And I'm just looking, okay, for any particular question, how does the evidence weigh on that question? And if I see a perceived inconsistency, then that's an invitation to go deeper. The perceived inconsistency is a point of tension. And I think sometimes what people will do is, because tension is kind of painful, they'll try to come up with a rule or a principle that protects people from having that kind of tension. So one rule would be like, don't trust anything that science say if it conflicts with the Bible. Or another rule I've seen is trust what Bible says or any religion says if it conflicts with science. So I've seen those rules. I think both those rules are actually unhelpful. They're unhelpful for me because I find that sometimes there's tension. That tension invites me to go deeper. And what I'll find is that by going deeper, I'll see a greater picture that shows how those things can go together. And sometimes what that means is modifying my understanding of what the Bible actually says. Sometimes that means modifying my understanding. Well, I've found many times I look into the science, and what's being reported that the science says is not actually what the scientific data actually shows. So oftentimes there's a difference between what the scientists say and what the science itself says, what the actual data is. And you'll never find that out if you just have a rule that just barricades you. It says, well, don't believe the scientists or don't believe the Bible. So I find it's like way more helpful just to take responsibility for your individual eyes and face the tension head on and go into more detail. And this is what I did when I had all my questions about the Bible for my dad, on every third page. And instead of just, getting simple answers, I went deeper. And the result of that was an expansion of understanding. And, that's the only way you can get out of a prison that changed your mind to a limiting belief. Because what if the Bible isn't accurate? What if it isn't true? Then, you want to actually be able to see that. And you want to be able to see that in principle. And so, have the courage really to just test everything out all the way out as far as you can and not be afraid of inconsistencies, but let them be invitations to go deeper.
Yeah.
So I know that's a long answer, but there's kind of a lot there. I'm really passionate about some of these principles behind that answer.
Sure.
So that's why I wanted to go into that detail.
Yeah. No. I know where Jonathan's coming from on his question. I want to get to other questions, so I can't, unfortunately, here. I can text him about that.
That's okay.
It says, this is from Salem, or at least that's a YouTube name there. It says, I just finished high school and am interested in taking philosophy in university. Are there any good universities in specific fields / subsets of philosophy that you would suggest? Sorry, I got tongue-tied there.
Well, this is a long conversation about your career goals, and because there's a fit between the universities. Obviously, the University of Notre Dame is very good philosophy and philosophy of religion. That's where I went. But sometimes there can be some stepping stones to some of these universities where you get a good master's degree at a college or university. So, this is one of those things where I feel like a helpful answer will involve kind of more kind of personalized interaction. University of Texas at Austin is a good one. They've got a good philosophy of language. But again, it's going to depend on kind of your aims and your goals. Yeah. So sorry not to have a more helpful answer, but I'd be happy to interact more personally on that question.
So I'm in a Master's of Arts program at Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is completely online. So I don't know who this person's is. Like you said, it would depend on a number of things. But as far as online in philosophy goes, it's very good. And it is a broadly Thomistic school. But but there's a lot of good programs out there. I'm trying to think of other MA in philosophies that you could do. I was always, but being able to do it online was what was biggest for me, because I just unfortunately don't have the resources to go and do it in person, which is obviously preferable. And since you just got out of high school, maybe you do have those resources. I'm an adult with a wife who's pregnant and things like that, so I can't go do that. But so it depends on a number of things.
I do have to add, Azusa Pacific University, where I teach, we've got online programs as well.
But the plug
excellent. Yeah, I mean, how could I not mention that? I mean, it's excellent. It's first rate, really.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so Is there since there is no canonical formulation that Dr. Rasmussen consistently cites, is there some good list of formulations available online? That'll be our last question.
Formulations
Is
of
there
the
is there
classical.
of the contingency argument? Are there different formulations brought
Oh
together
yeah.
that you can find somewhere?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So on my website, if you go to joshualrasmussen.com, you will see I've got a list of articles and publications, and I have several different publications on this argument. One of them is just called Cosmological Arguments from Contingency, and that might be the best one. Another one is called the Cosmological or the Argument from Contingency, and between those two, I think those would probably be the most helpful
Mm-hmm.
that I've seen.
Okay, so I'm going to address this last question. It says, hello, brother, talking to me. Are you going to be debating an engineer atheist soon? If so, is there a date? So, yes, I have agreed to debate Godless Engineer. John Gleason is his actual name. He's a famous popular, really well known on YouTube. The subject is going to be on Jesus mythicism. John is a Jesus mythicist. So he believes that Jesus was not a historical figure that walked the face of the earth. And I want to emphasize the walk the face of the earth part because that's what I'm going to prove. It's actually the subject is going to be, did Paul believe in a historical Jesus? And by historical, we mean a Jesus who walked the face of the earth, which I know to a lot of people is going to be odd that you have to add that in there, that's what I have to prove, but that is the qualification. And I think it's quite obvious from even a cursory reading of Paul's genuine, I'm only going to argue from his genuine 7 letters. I think he obviously wrote more than that, but from a critical scholarship standpoint, I'm only going to argue from those. And even from that, I think it's quite obvious that he did believe in a historical Jesus. And so that's going to be on July 23rd at 7 p.m. Central Time. And it's going to be on a YouTube channel called Adherent Apologetics. I think it's a YouTube channel that's just starting to host debates and dialogues like that. So I am going to be participating in that. I know if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you've probably heard me say that I'm not interested in doing debates, but for whatever reason, I am interested in doing this one, so I am going to do it. So yeah, that's that. But Dr. Rasmussen, thanks so much for joining me, sir. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed the conversation with you, and we'll definitely have to have you back on sometime. Real quickly, again, don't forget in the description below, you'll find links to Dr. Rasmussen's website as well as his books. You should check those out, get a hold of them. It's really good stuff. And again, if you want to watch the bonus segment, 5 more minutes with Dr. Josh Rasmussen, as well as all of our other bonus segments, you can follow the Patreon link in the description below and become a supporter. Dr. Josh, thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you.